bergère, the rage is Josephine Baker, daughter of a St. Louis washerwoman.
She was one of the most glamorous women in the world, yet she died nearly penniless. She danced in Paris nightclubs wearing a skirt made of bananas, but dreamed of building a family that would heal the wounds of racism. She was a war hero, a civil rights icon, a global superstar, and a single mother to 11 children she adopted from different corners of the world. Josephine Baker called them her Rainbow Tribe. She believed that if children of different races and cultures could be raised as siblings, the world might finally understand peace. But the reality was far more complicated. Some of her children called her a visionary. Others say they felt like part of a social experiment. This is the untold story of what happened after the cameras stopped rolling, of what became of Josephine Baker's 11 children, and how they remember the woman who tried to change the world by raising them under one roof. She was born Frida Josephine McDonald in 1906 in the heart of St. Louis, Missouri, a place marked by segregation and fear, where black children were reminded daily of their limits. Her mother was a laundress, her father, a vaudeville drummer who vanished before her first birthday. She grew up in poverty, often hungry, often humiliated. By 8, she was working as a domestic servant for white families who made her sleep in the basement and beat her for touching their children. She would later say, "I wasn't permitted to speak to them. I was only allowed to smile. So I smiled until my face hurt." By 12, she dropped out of school. By 13, she was married to Willie Wells, a marriage that barely lasted a month. She joined a street vaudeville troupe and danced her way east, scraping by with little more than grit and charm. At 15, she married again, this time to Willie Baker. The marriage failed, but the name stuck. Josephine Baker was born. And then, like so many black artists before and after her, she found herself in a country that loved her talent but hated her skin. She once said, "I was afraid to be black in America, afraid to walk in my own country." So she did something radical. She left. In 1925, she boarded a ship for Paris to join La Revue Negre, a musical revue starring black American performers. And in Paris, everything changed. She stepped onto the stage of the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées in a skirt made of rubber bananas, and the audience froze. Then they erupted. Paris had never seen anything like her. Her comedy, her confidence, her sensuality. She wasn't just dancing. She was challenging, daring, alive. Even my teeth and eyes burned with fever. Each time I leaped, I seemed to touch the sky, she later recalled. In the jazz age capital of Europe, Josephine Baker became an overnight sensation. She was dubbed the Black Venus, the Creole goddess, the high priestess of primitive rhythms. Her face was printed on posters. Her image inspired sculptures. She headlined the Folies Bergère, danced with a cheetah on stage, and broke every rule that had held her back in America. By 1927, she was the highest-paid entertainer in Europe. "I wasn't really naked," she once said of her infamous banana dance. "I simply didn't have any clothes on." But behind the feathers and sequins was a savvy businesswoman and a woman with something to prove. She starred in films like Siren of the Tropics and Zuzu, becoming the first black woman to lead a motion picture in Europe. She adopted French fashion, language, and eventually French citizenship, marrying Jean Léon, a Jewish industrialist, in 1937. That marriage gave her not just legal status in France, but protection from rising anti-Semitism and a new identity, a global citizen. "I have two loves," she famously said, "my country and Paris." But America? That was still complicated. In 1936, she tried to return to the U.S. to perform on Broadway. She was met with racism, ridicule, and rejection. Critics mocked her accent. Clubs wouldn't serve her. She returned to France bitter and disillusioned, more determined than ever to live on her own terms. Then, as war engulfed Europe, Josephine didn't run. She fought. She joined the French resistance, using her fame as a cover to carry secret messages in sheet music, attend high-level gatherings, and smuggle intelligence across borders. Hitler called her dangerous. France called her a hero. She earned the Croix de Guerre, the Rosette of the Resistance, and was made a Chevalier of the Legion of Honor, one of France's highest civilian awards. But for Josephine Baker, even war medals weren't enough. By the time the war ended and the world returned to fractured peace, she was already dreaming of something even more radical. A family. Not just a biological one, but a symbolic one. A tribe of children from all over the world, raised together in a single home as living proof that hate was a choice, and that love, if taught early enough, could overcome everything. And if you are into classic Hollywood icons, amazing stories, and newly discovered insights, then hit that subscribe button. We are on our way to 10,000 subscribers, and your support will mean a lot to our channel. And so, she bought a castle. After the war and tour lights had dimmed, Josephine Baker sought something deeper than applause. She had conquered poverty, fame, prejudice, and she had survived. But now, in the leafy solitude of Château de Milandes, she envisioned her greatest legacy: family. She believed racism isn't innate, but learned. So she set out to teach its opposite: compassion, unity, belonging. She called it the Rainbow Tribe, a living symbol of global harmony, composed of children from around the world, raised as siblings. In her own words, "People say I'm crazy, but I want to show the world that children of different colors, different religions, can still be family. That racism is not born, it is taught." One by one, children joined her vision. First came Akio, born in Japan around 1952, and shortly after Jeannot, born about 1953, also Japanese. Josephine later recalled writing to orphanages in Japan, requesting 2 boys for her family experiment. Then Hari arrived from Finland, born circa 1954, blonde-haired and raised Christian, chosen to represent Northern Europe. Luis from Colombia joined around the same time, dark-skinned and vibrant, adopted through a Latin American agency. Each pairing was intentional, a visual and spiritual balance. In 1957, amid Algeria's struggle, came Brahim, later known as Brian, his adoption both personal and political. Raised between Catholic and Muslim traditions, he embodied Josephine's belief in spiritual unity. From Morocco came Stelina, a North African girl with deep almond eyes. From Venezuela came Mara, vibrant and loud in her Latin roots. And from the Ivory Coast came Kofi, a proud child of African heritage, all arriving mid-1950s. Closer to home were Noel, found abandoned in Paris near Christmas, a name she chose, and Moïse, born in France in 1951. Josephine specifically sought a Jewish child and contacted a Parisian rabbi. Moïse was circumcised and raised in that faith. There was also Marianne, of Algerian descent but born in France, and finally Jean-Claude, born April 18, 1943, in Dijon. Though not legally adopted, she took him in at 14 when he worked as a bellhop. He later called himself her son, her chronicler, and even ran a New York restaurant in her name. All 12, Akio, Jeannot, Jarry, Luis, Brian, Stelina, Mara, Kofi, Noel, Moïse, Marianne, Jean-Claude, grew up under the roof of Château de Milandes, dressed in traditional garments, taught in multiple languages, and guided in faiths from Buddhism and Judaism to Islam and Christianity. As Jean-Claude later reflected, she wanted a doll, a haunting admission of intent and control. And as historian Matthew Pratt Guttrell asked, was there a burden to bear on a dozen children? In constructing a metaphor for the world, Josephine had to answer for the cost. Josephine saw her chateau as a global village, her children as proof. But even she knew the high price of living one's ideals. This was her dream, bold, radical, beautiful. But the dream, like childhood, would not last forever. Life at Château de Milandes looked like a fairy tale from the outside. Tourists came by the busload to see Josephine Baker's Village of the World. They wandered the sprawling gardens, ate at the castle's restaurant, and watched her children play like living emblems of peace. Some days it felt like a utopia. The chateau echoed with laughter, languages, and music from every continent. Birthdays were celebrated with pageantry. Holidays honored every faith. The world in miniature existed behind those stone walls. But inside the dream, reality was far more complex. Josephine was often away, touring across Europe, singing, performing, doing whatever she could to keep the chateau funded. She was, as always, the engine. But it meant that the children were raised mostly by nannies and staff, not always by Josephine herself. When she was there, Jean-Claude later said, she was warm, playful, generous, but she was also commanding. We were her vision, not just her children. She expected them to perform, not on stage, but in life, to embody the harmony she wanted the world to believe in. The children were not permitted to fight or question their identities. When Jarry began struggling with his sexuality as a teenager, Josephine reportedly sent him away to live with Jo Bouillon in Argentina. She feared it would disrupt the harmony she had so carefully constructed. Brian, her Algerian-born son, would later say, "We weren't allowed to be ordinary children. We were there to prove a point." The chateau, while beautiful, was also a pressure cooker. Each child was expected to dress in the traditional garments of their native culture, to speak their native language, to represent their people. They were tokens in a mosaic, not just a family, but a living exhibit. And while Josephine's intentions may have been noble, they were also controlling. Jean-Claude once remarked, "She loved us, but she wanted to choreograph our lives." By the late 1950s and early 1960s, the cost of the dream began to catch up with her. Château de Milandes was massively expensive to maintain. The zoo, the staff, the tours, it all required a constant influx of money. But Josephine's star was fading. Audiences were moving on. Concerts paid less. The castle bled money. She borrowed against the property, took out loans she couldn't repay. At one point, she performed at a cabaret in Beirut just to cover a single mortgage payment. In 1964, after defaulting on her debts, the chateau was repossessed. The family was evicted. Josephine reportedly collapsed on the front steps, unconscious with grief. "I built this for peace," she said, watching strangers carry her furniture away. "And now it's gone." The Rainbow tribe scattered. Some were taken in by friends. Others lived briefly with Jo Bouillon, who had separated from Josephine. A few distanced themselves completely, disappearing into adult lives far from the dream that had defined their childhood. And Josephine, she never stopped believing. She kept performing, kept speaking out. She held fast to the vision of her family even as it fell apart. But for the children, the legacy was more complicated. They had lived inside a dream, but they had also paid the price for it. When the gates of Château de Milandes finally closed, the fantasy unraveled. The Rainbow tribe, once paraded for tourists as living proof of world peace, was scattered across countries, continents, and broken memories. The ideal was over. What remained were real children, now young adults, left to make sense of the performance they had been cast into. Josephine had lost the chateau in 1964. Crushed by debt, she watched as furniture, photos, and keepsakes were hauled off by creditors. She collapsed on the steps, unconscious, while strangers repossessed her dream. She was never the same after that. And neither were the children. Jean-Claude Baker, the unofficial 13th child, would later write in his searing biography, "She loved the world, but could be cruel to the ones closest to her. We were symbols, proof, but not always children." He revealed what no press ever saw: a mother who demanded total obedience, children who were beaten when they disobeyed, paraded when they pleased, punishments that blurred into humiliation, and a love that was conditional, tied to how well they played their role. Jean-Claude recalled Josephine dragging one of the children into the courtyard and beating him with a riding crop while guests dined inside. Another time, she locked a child in a cellar for hours because he had misbehaved during a photo shoot. She called it discipline, he wrote. I called it theater by force. Jari, the Finnish son, was cast as the Nordic Christian child. But when Josephine discovered he was gay as a teenager, she reacted with cold rejection. She packed him off to live with her estranged ex-husband, Joe Bouillon, in Argentina. It didn't fit the picture, Jean-Claude later said, so she erased it. Brian, born in Algeria, described the chateau as both a palace and a prison. He loved Josephine, but admitted she micromanaged their lives, even deciding what languages they could speak at home to preserve the illusion of cultural diversity. Behind the scenes, French nannies raised most of the children, and affection came on a schedule. One child, Noel, was diagnosed with schizophrenia and institutionalized. Jean-Claude believed his mental health deteriorated, in part because of the impossible expectations placed on him from childhood. Others simply vanished from public memory. Luis, Stelina, Coffee, Mara, and Marianne, they retreated into adulthood with little interest in the legacy that had shaped them. Few of them had children of their own. Fewer still spoke publicly about their upbringing. Even Jean-Claude, her most loyal defender, admitted, Josephine was not made to be a mother. She adopted us for a cause, not for cuddles. She dreamed of saving the world, but she did not know how to care for children, and yet, despite everything, most of them never stopped loving her. They called her Maman. They worried about her finances, her health, her loneliness in the final years. They showed up when she needed them, even if she hadn't always done the same. In 1975, Josephine Baker made a dazzling return to the stage in Paris. It was her 50th anniversary in show business, and the reviews were glowing. But just days later, she was found in her bed, unconscious, surrounded by newspapers praising her comeback. She died shortly after of a brain hemorrhage. She was 68. Her funeral was massive, attended by thousands. The French military honored her with a 21-gun salute, and in 2021, she became the first black woman to be inducted into the Pantheon in Paris. But long before France embraced her legacy, her children had lived through it. They had seen both the spotlight and the shadows, and for some of them, the performance never truly ended. Josephine Baker lived her life on her own terms, bold, unfiltered, defiant. She had no map to follow, no example to emulate. She built her world from scratch, through courage, through risk, through brilliance, and often through pain. She's remembered today not just as an entertainer, but as a symbol of resistance, motherhood, and ambition larger than life. In 2021, she became the first black woman, the first American-born woman, and the first performing artist to be inducted into the Pantheon, France's most hallowed resting place, joining the likes of Voltaire, Victor Hugo, and Marie Curie. President Emmanuel Macron said at the ceremony, "She fought for liberty and justice in France and beyond. She is proof that a person can be born in one place but belong to humanity. Schools bear her name, boulevards, statues. Her image is taught in classrooms, her dances studied by performers, her songs still sung. Her life has become a blueprint for what it means to live fearlessly and give generously. But part of her legacy is also cautionary, because her greatest dream, the Rainbow Tribe, remains unfinished. A beautiful idea, born from love, but flawed in its execution. A vision that asked children to carry the weight of the world. Some were grateful, others were scarred. All were changed. Still, the world remembers Josephine not just for what she achieved, but for what she attempted. To dance through history with dignity, to fight fascism with courage, to raise a family with hope, and to prove that difference is not a threat, but a gift. As she once said, "I like people. I like them because they are different. I never met a person I didn't want to understand." In the end, Josephine Baker's life was not about perfection. It was about possibility. And that is how she is remembered today, a war hero, a civil rights warrior, a global icon who rose from poverty in St. Louis to the heights of Parisian fame. She was the first black woman to star in a major motion picture, the first to refuse segregated shows, the first American-born woman to be laid to rest in the Pantheon of France. And yet, her boldest legacy, the Rainbow Tribe, is not just a story of harmony. It is also a story of hurt, of control, of good intentions that outgrew their reach. She tried to choreograph a family the way she choreographed her performances, beautifully, deliberately, and to prove a point. But children aren't dancers, and they don't exist to fulfill a dream. As Jean-Claude Baker once said, "She had the biggest heart in the world, but it didn't always know how to hold children." Still, even those who questioned her methods rarely questioned her heart. She believed, perhaps naively, that love alone could solve what war, politics, and hatred never could. And in a world teetering between division and connection, that belief still resonates. Today, Josephine Baker is honored not just for what she was, but for what she dared to attempt. She refused to live by anyone else's script. She played every role: star, spy, mother, martyr. She won medals from generals, kissed kings, and raised a dozen children from across the globe to call each other family. And even if her experiment failed in practice, it succeeded in spirit. Because her life forced the world to ask, what if we raised our children to see difference not as danger, but as beauty? In her own words, "I am not a myth. I am a woman who loves justice." And perhaps that is Josephine Baker's most enduring act. Not perfection, but possibility.